So hi Jane, it's lovely to have you and I'm excited about our first Cowgirlblues knit along.
Thanks, Bridget. I'm looking forward to this as well. It feels like we've been preparing for this for ages and now it's finally here. So welcome everyone. And first of all, I need to apologize. I had a technical issue and discovered that the pattern that I had posted on Ravelry was an early version and not the updated version. I got no idea how that happened. So you did get the update, but there's not a lot of changes, and I'll go through the changes as we go for section 1 for now, and each week as we go through it, I'll give you whatever the changes were. But if you do want to reprint the pages that you only really need to worry about are pages 2 to 7. I am very fussy about tension squares, and I highly recommend knitting a tension square for this shawl before you start. The amount of yarn that I have given for this shawl is very tight. So you really do need to knit a tension square. As you go through it, if you are even just 2 stitches out in your tension square, by the time you're knitting your last few rows, 2 stitches over 10 centimeters is going to be more than 10 stitches out in total at the end. So please be aware of that and knit your tension square. And
Jane, just a question about the tension squares. One of the things that's often confusing is whether one should get the number of stitches or the number of rows right, because often they don't both match up. I have always understood that it's more important to get the number of stitches correct. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. So if your tension square is shorter than what is recommended, that doesn't matter, because the pattern works on rows, and we're going row by row. So you'll end up with the same number of rows. But if your particularly if your square is bigger than my recommendation, I would recommend going down a needle size.
Okay, great, thanks.
And okay, another reason to do a tension square is to check your drape. And if you've got a really tight tension, you're not going to have a nice drape. And you can see from this shawl how it does drape. So you're going to want to get that drape in your stitching. I've also got a number of different stitches that I've used in this shawl. And if your tension is too loose, you're going to lose some of that stitch definition, particularly when you do the mosaic, you're going to lose some of that. And also when you do the honeycomb. And I've got the honeycomb here at the top. You can't see it too clearly at the moment, but you'll get there. So you're going to want to make sure that your stitches have a really nice definition as well. So 3 reasons to do your tension squares. Okay, so we're going to start off by casting on, and you can do 2 different casts on. And you're only going to start with 5 stitches, so it's really, really simple. You're going to leave yourself a tail of about 20 centimeters, because you're going to use that tail when you come to add your tassel. So it's going to be used to stitch your tassel on. So about 20 centimeters is what I use. So you can do 2 different types of cast-ons. One is a long tail cast-on, and the way I do that is I give myself a reasonable length. I fold the thread over and I hold the thread with my finger and my thumb between that, and then my finger on top. And that becomes my first stitch. So with the long tail cast on, I'm going to go under from the front of my thumb, under from the front of my first finger, and back through the loop over my thumb, and drop it and pull it. And don't pull it too tight, otherwise your first row of stitches are going to be very difficult. So we'll do that again. So it's under my thumb, over and under the yarn on my first finger, and between the two loops, and that gives me 3. So we do that again, under and over and through. Under and over and through. So that's one cast on, and I quite like this cast on because you can see, where's the camera? There's the camera. It gives me a really, really nice edge. It's nice and straight and smooth. The other cast on that I really like is what's called a cable cast on, and I leave my tail and create a slip stitch. And I knit my first stitch, but I don't drop it. I carry that over and hook it with my left needle, and then I drop it onto the needle. I put my needle between those 2 stitches and knit. Take that thread over and through onto my left hand needle and drop it, and then through again, and knit it, and through and over, and my last one. So you can do either one of those 2 cast-ons. Both of them give you a really nice neat edge. And if everyone's ready with their cast on, we'll go straight into the first row. What I've done in the pattern on the first page is I've given you what happens with the first 5 stitches of every row and the last of every right side row, sorry, the last 3 stitches of every right side row, the first 3 stitches of every wrong side row, and the last 3 stitches of every wrong side row. And that's just to get you into the pattern of what happens right at the beginning and right at the end. So even though I have given those instructions all the way through of what to do with those first 5 and last 3, it's just if you put your work down and you want to knit without having to look at the pattern, you know what has to happen anyway, because there are various stages through this pattern where you don't need to be looking at the pattern, you can get into the momentum of it. So when you've got your first 5 stitches, we're going straight into creating the I-cord. So the I-cord consists of the first 3 stitches being knitted. So we're going to knit those first 3 stitches. And we need to be creating stitches as we go. So to create a stitch, we knit into the front of the stitch. Don't pull the stitch off your needle. Knit into the back of the same stitch. And knit one. And there already I've got 6 stitches. What happens with the increases and decreases at the beginning of the row is it creates a boomerang shape of your shawl. And if you have a look here I've got my I-cord edge. Along here is the I-cord edge. And here is the edge where I increase. And can you see very quickly, you start to get that boomerang shape. And the I-cord works really nicely on both the back side and the front side. It gives you a really, really nice neat edge. So the I-cord edge ends up being the one side of the triangle. The other side of the triangle, we're going to be finishing off with a lace, and the top side of the shawl is this increased edge. Okay, so second row. To create this edge, and you can see it's an even edge all the way along, I always slip my first stitch on my wrong side purlwise. So with my yarn in front, I put my needle through the stitch as if I'm going to purl. But I slip that stitch off and take my yarn to the back to be able to knit the next stitch. So the next stitch, I knit 2, yarn forward, and this is part of the I-cord. You always slip your last 3 stitches on the wrong side row. If I'm going too fast, please say so. And if you've got any questions, you're welcome to ask. If you type into the chat, I do have the chat window open, so I can see if any questions come up there. Okay, so the third row is knit 3, and by knitting 3 after having slipped them, this is what's going to pull those 3 stitches into a cord. And again, knit into the front and the back, and knit 2. And you should now have 7 stitches. Is everyone with me? Okay, 4th row, again, it's a wrong side row. So I slip my first stitch purlwise, take it off my needle and take the yarn to the back of the work. And I knit 3 this time. And then I bring my yarn forward and slip the last 3 stitches. And this part is going to be very quick and easy for you to get into the habit of bringing your yarn forward and slipping those 3 stitches. Okay, row 5. Again, it's the I-cord edge. Knit the first 3 stitches. And if you have a look at your work when you've done that, you can quickly see that you've got an I-cord forming. And now we're going to do the SSK, which is slip 1, knitwise, slip the second stitch knitwise, put your needle into the front of those 2 stitches and knit them. And then you're going to do a knit front and back and knit 1. Okay, next row, it's a wrong side row, so slip your first stitch purlwise. And you're going to knit 1, knit into the front and the back of the same stitch. And then you're going to knit 1 again. And you've got 3 stitches left on your needle, so it's yarn forward and slip those 3. Is everyone keeping up? Anyone got any problems? Everyone seems to be doing okay. Great. Okay, on the right side, first 3 stitches, knit. And on the right side, after you've done your knitted your first 3 stitches, you do your SSK. And this is what you're going to do throughout the shawl. And this gives you the boomerang as well. You can see here, because I've decreased along this edge after my I cord, you can see the curve shape. And I'm then going to knit front and back and knit 2. And can you see how your edge is developing a really nice neat edge, and how your I cord is starting to curl over?
Jane, the edges really do look very nice and neat. It makes such a big difference to have a little bit of detail in the pattern around the edges to keep that consistent.
Yes, it does. And I think as well, it finishes off a garment really nicely when you've got your neat edges that you don't have to try and hide.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're now on row 8. So slip your first stitch purlwise, yarn to the back, knit 1, knit into the front and back, and I'm going to be knitting 2. Yarn forward, slip your next 3 stitches. And from now you can start getting into the pattern. You know what you're going to be doing in your first 5 stitches and your last 3 stitches. So we're going to be knitting your first 3 stitches on your right side, and it's SSK. And we know we have to work the last 3 stitches, so I've only got 1 to knit on this row. My knit front and back, and knit 2. Okay, so you should all be starting to get into the pattern of how the right and wrong side edges work. So we're now on row 10. So I'm going to slip 1 purlwise, knit 1, knit into the front and the back, and I can work out how many stitches I need to knit because I've got 3 stitches which will be my I cord, so I've got 3 stitches left to knit. And then I bring my yarn forward and I slip those 3 stitches. And that's how you're going to carry on until you have 30 stitches on your needle. And what happens is on the right side, you decrease once and increase once. So the number of stitches doesn't change on your right side. But on your wrong side row, you only increase, there's no decreases, and that's where the increase happens. But the increase at the end of the row on the right side helps to form the shape. And again, we can look at the shape here.
Jane, can I suggest we take a minute and just check in with everyone and see how they're doing, if things are making sense?
Certainly.
Yeah. Do they want to take a couple of minutes to catch up? Lauren, how are you and your mum getting on? You're still on mute. There we go.
go.
Yes. Is that all making sense? Are you doing okay?
My mom's struggling a little bit, but she's trying to watch what Jane's doing and not following on the pattern.
And read the, and that part can be a little confusing.
So you got to actually listen to what Jane's doing and then just follow on the patterns.
Yes, and sort of just take a minute to go, okay,
yes,
what am I doing here? Yeah, it's almost like your ears and your hands and your eyes can't all keep up.
No,
what's going on?
So it's almost like you're an audio book.
Yeah, and it's like you have to decide, are you reading the book or listening to the book?
Yeah.
I am going to show you how to hide tails in the cord, because it is marvelous, as I've been doing here, but we'll get there. But you do need your tail for the tassel, because what I want to show you next, but I'd like everyone to get a bit further along, to show you how to hide your threads inside your I-cord. And it makes it so nice and neat when they're hidden away.
So it's almost like that can be a reason for putting an I-cord on the edge of things, is especially if you've got lots of color changes, is because you can tuck them away on the inside.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when you add in another color, I'm just going to grab my color here. Because you finished the last bit of work on your wrong side for me with this blue, I'm going to knit my first 3 stitches with that same blue. If I add another color, I lose my I-cord. Okay, so now is when I add my I-cord, and I just dangle the thread at the back and I knit my work for now. So I've still got to do the SSK. But I start knitting now with my second color.
So Jane, I think you have to give us a running commentary as you're going of a soundtrack, because remember you're an audiobook at the moment.
Oh yes, I'm an audiobook. Okay,
yes.
So I'm knitting up until my last 3 stitches on my wrong side row, and that last stitch that was my first stitch on the previous row is very loose. So I'm just going to pull it tight so that it's the same tension as the other stitches. Bring my yarn forward and slip my next 3 stitches. And again, you can see the first stitch of my I-cord, because I've left that, is loose. So I give that a little tug so that it's the same tension as my previous, at least as my other stitches, and turn my work. Sorry, I'm getting tangled up in yarn and needles here. So now, because I ended with my second color, I'm going to knit my I-cord in my second color, but my I-cord is being worked up. So I'm not going to put my threads below, because they're not going to end up being hidden inside the I-cord. So I take my yarn that I'm working with underneath the other yarns, and I've got it in my right yarn in my right hand, and you can see these yarns are now on top. So now if I knit, and I knit my I-cord and do my SSK, and I'm not worrying about this just yet. You can see I've got a loop from that loose stitch. I'm not going to worry about it just yet. And I do my SSK. And now what I can do is turn my work and just give that stitch a tug. And I knit to the end of the row. Well, not quite to the end, to the last 3 stitches. and knit front and back and knit 2. Turn my work. And I'm going to be knitting again to my last 3 stitches. So I slip my first stitch purlwise, knit my next stitch, and knit into the front and back of the 3rd stitch. And I knit to the last 3. And there I am, yarn forward, and I'm going to slip my next 3 stitches. Turn my work. And I last worked with my second color. And again, it needs to come underneath the other threads. So I'm going to be coming back to using the blue. So I don't cut it off. It's still there. And I'm working it in through the I-cord as I go. So when I need to use it, it's there, ready to use.
So Jane, you're almost knitting the I-cord around those threads and keeping them in that little I-cord tube.
Yes. So what happens here, I've done a length of the 2 of mixing colors through the I-cord. And here I've got a whole selection of threads, which I'm working under. And they're all tucked in underneath there and inside there. And there's no loose ends, no weaving of threads, no threads to worry about at the end. It's all done right as you work. So at the end, all you need to do is worry about tucking away the very last thread and using the first thread to make your tassel.
Okay. And
so it's as simple as that.
It looks a little sort of like you've got a huge bunch of threads there, but part of that is because you've got the color that you're carrying up the side because you're going to use it again, and you've got the tail from where you started the thread in. If that's feeling a little overwhelming, you could leave the tails behind and just use a needle to thread them into the I-cord afterwards.
You could, but also what I've done is I wanted to show you what the bulk ends up being like, even when you've got as many as 4 threads with their tails. And you can see here, I've got, I think 8 threads here, six, and I've got 7 threads here. And you can see they're all inside here. And it doesn't look any bulkier than it does down here when there's nothing.
Yeah. No, it's very neat.
So don't worry, so don't worry about how many threads you're carrying inside your I-cord.
Okay, great.
Okay, it keeps it really, really nice and neat. So this was just to show you that you can carry quite a lot of threads through the I-cord without it making a difference. Okay, so let's go back to this. So I've done 4 rows with my second color, and I want to go back to my blue. But the last yarn that I used was my second color. So I'm going to knit my I-cord or my first 3 stitches with that second color. And I only change over when I do the SSK. So I had tucked the yarn underneath, and I'm dropping that, and I'm picking up my first color and SSK. And I start knitting with my second color. And I'll show you what that looks like on the wrong side in a moment. And knit into the front and the back and knit 2 for the end of the row. Turn my work, and wrong side row, slip your first stitch purlwise, and knit 1, knit front and back into the third stitch. And can you see here where there's a transition between the two colors? There's no difference in the stitches at all. It just continues, and there's a flow to the color change. So I'm going to knit to my last 3 stitches. And then I'll bring my yarn forward. And slip my last 3 stitches, which will be my I-cord. Okay, so now if I'm going to do another row with the blue, I'm going to make sure that the blue comes underneath those other threads. So there's the blue underneath. Can you see that? It's coming underneath, which means that if I pull it tight, can you see it's going to tuck in those 2 threads? So I'm going to knit my I-cord. And do my SSK. And knit to the last 3 stitches. Knit into the front and back, and knit 2. And on the I-cord, the color does end up being almost displaced from the rows you were doing to the rows on the I-cord, but I don't worry about that at all. I'd rather have no holes from the stitches being formed properly. And here you can see this is ready to carry on going up, and the threads end up being inside my I-cord. I think I forgot to go underneath. I think I did. But you can see there the blue is crossing over. Can you see that? The blue is crossing over, so it's going to be pulling these stitches into the I-cord.
Jane, it's quite good to see that actually if you do miss one row, it's not the end of the world. As long as you catch it in
later on,
yes, afterwards, it's going to be fine. So if you want to be very detailed about it, you can always go back and fix it, but it isn't the end of the world if you don't.
No. And if you do have a thread and you forget to do anything with it, then at the end you take that thread and just thread it into the I-cord. So it is very easy to get rid of if you need to. So I knit into the front and back of my third stitch on my wrong side, and knit to the last 3 stitches. Yarn forward and slip those 3. Okay. So now if I'm going to change color again, I finished off with the blue on the previous row. So my I-cord stitches are going to be knitted with the blue. Except this is where I went wrong before. Is it? Yes, it is. Okay, so when you knit your last 3 stitches, always make sure that your yarn goes underneath those threads. That's where I made my mistake on the previous row. Okay, so always bring your stitches at least your yarn underneath the threads before you knit your I-cord. And then SSK, but I'm changing color. So now I'll change color and do my SSK in my second color again. So the place where it's really easy to forget about taking your thread, your yarn underneath the threads that you're carrying through is when you're doing your third row in that color. It's what we usually do is just carry on knitting. But in this instance, you need to remember to take it underneath. That was how I made my mistake earlier. So when you take it underneath, these carry on going over. And you can see I've got my 2 blue threads, which will end up pulling that over. And where I didn't carry it, it's more or less hidden anyway. You're not going to examine every single row on the shawl when you're finished. Slip first stitch purlwise, knit 1, knit yarn front and back, and knit to the last 3 stitches. And I've got 2 more to go. And I bring my yarn forward and slip my last 3 stitches. And before I knit my I-cord, I've got to remember to take that thread, that yarn, underneath the other 2 yarns. So there it is. And that's going to catch the threads into the I-cord. So every row, remember, go underneath those threads. And I knit my first 3 stitches, SSK. And knit to the last 3 stitches. And if I do end up with a section where it's a bit loose, that does get pulled in with your tension as you go. And I'm knitting to my last 3 stitches. Knit into the front and to the back, and knit 2. And you can see your edge developing and your I-cord developing, as well as the shape of the shawl.
It's quite exciting that so early on in the project you can see the detail quite easily, because I think that's often one thing that can be a little disheartening and frustrating, is that sometimes it can take a very long time before you start to see it taking shape. But here you can see the curves starting, you can see those lovely edges, you can see the ends are hidden away.
Yes. So on this, I've got to row 80, and you can see how the shape, let me turn it this way. I've got too many yarns in front of me. You can see the shape forming. And I haven't yet finished the first section on this, but there it is.
Yeah, nice.
Yes. So this, what I've shown you today, will take you to row 118.
I wanted to say to everyone that I've created a group on Ravelry for this knit along, but I would love to have you join the group, because having created the group, it would be very nice to have a few people in my group. Jane, I think I might have invited you. I think I hadn't actually got any further than that. But it'd also be great. I don't know if you're all comfortable using Ravelry or if you post pictures and things there, but it'd be lovely to see some pictures of your work in progress as you go. If you're not comfortable posting them, you can always send them to me and I can stick them in there.
So one thing I do recommend is to use a row marker, either a row marker or else tick off your rows as you go. If you put your work down and you don't know where you are, it's not always easy to pick it up and say, well, this is exactly where I am. So use a row marker or tick them off so that you know where you're going. So by next Wednesday, all you need to have done is up to row 118. And it might seem like a lot of rows, but you only finish off with 64 stitches. So it goes quickly.
And how many rows is that?
80 rows.
Okay, so it's not like insane amounts of knitting.
No.
Well,
no.
I mean, obviously that depends on the amount of time you have available.
This section, to get your first 30 rows, you're all going to have this done before the end of this morning.
In theory.
Yes,
I see a few dubious expressions on the...
So it is very quick to do that, certainly the first part.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Good.
So yeah, so that's only 80 rows. So it does go very quickly.
Okay. Excellent. Now, does anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
I'm quite pleased I've pulled mine out. I was actually up to 68, but I hadn't realized that when you change color, you change after the 3 stitches on the edge.
Oh, okay.
I was changing my color from the first stitch.
Okay.
I'm pleased actually.
Jane, what difference does it make to your knitting to do it one way versus the other?
So if I'm going to change color and start knitting now with my blue here, let me get there.
Hold on 1 second, because I just have to replace the spotlight with your hands. Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to finish knitting this wrong side row, and then I'll join in with the blue, and then you can see what happens. It loses both the I cord. It creates almost a loose I cord, and you end up with a loose stitch, which is, excuse my dogs. I think there's a cow pulling on a tree on the other side of the fence.
And the dogs know that cows are not allowed to touch your trees?
Well, it's just a cow. It's too close.
Oh, okay. Okay, they're not protecting the garden from the cows.
No,
okay.
No. When we go out walking, the cows are fair game.
Okay.
Yeah, they've got to be careful when there's calves, because then they get kicked.
Yes.
The mothers get protective. Okay, so if I'm going to change now to my second color, first of all, my yarn is further down. So I'm not going to be hiding my threads, because it means going over the top of them if I want to hide them, which is defeating the purpose of the I cord, of hiding your threads inside the I cord. And if I start knitting straight away, it's almost as if I've just knitted 3 stitches and I haven't pulled in an I cord at all. So if I do my SSK now, and I've got a very loose stitch here, and can you see it almost creates a hole? Even if I try and pull that tight, you've got this hole there. You can see my nail sticking through. So even if I've tried to pull it tight to do away with that, it doesn't. It leaves all of this open. by starting knitting the row with your color change. And you want to prevent that.
Okay, that's helpful.
Okay, yeah. So that's why you go back to using the color you finished the previous row off with for your first 3 stitches of your I-cord.
Okay, thanks for that, Sue, because if you hadn't asked that question, we wouldn't have looked at that in a little more detail, so thank you. Any other questions from anyone, or comments, or anything else you want to ask?
That last little bit, you know, my mistake there, or what I did, makes you realize that it's a good idea to follow, not to try and get too far ahead if you're not a
Yeah, especially if you have the option of being able to see how things are done.
So even if I'm going to change, so let me just show you, if I'm going to do a purl row on the wrong side row, what we do with the threads. I haven't shown you that. We've just worked in garter stitch so far. So I'm going to change my thread to the blue, but before I do so, I need to knit my first 3 stitches in the white, carrying the white underneath those threads, and knit my first 3. And my next stitches are going to be my stocking stitch rows. So I'm going to knit my first row, and I'm going to knit to my last 3 stitches. Because I also haven't shown you purling into the front and the back of a stitch. Okay, so knit into the front and back of this stitch, knit 2, and then turn my work. So this is going to be a purl row. And as per always, I slip my first stitch purlwise, but I don't take my yarn to the back of the work. I keep it in front because I'm going to purl the next stitch, and then I'm going to purl into the front and purl into the back.
You come from the wrong side.
Yes.
In the back of the stitch.
Yes. So I'm purling into the front as normal, but then I go from behind that stitch and purl the stitch. And then I purl to the last 3 stitches. And this is my stocking stitch. And this is rows 51 and 52 is how we do this. My last 3 stitches, my yarn is already in front. I don't need to move it. It stays there. And I slip my last 3 stitches. And that's as simple as it can be. And there's my stocking stitch rows. On my Ravelry page, where you bought the pattern from, at the end on notes, where there are already 2 videos for you to watch. So today's video will be included into that, and everyone who's signed up will get an email for an update to the notes.
Okay,
with
cool.
the pattern link.
Bring your friends along as well next week, and put some pictures in the Ravelry group for us, and looking forward to seeing your progress. And thanks very much, Jane, for a great session and lots of helpful information. And yeah, we will be back again next week.